a very brief introduction to Stradia and who we are and what we do. So we're a firm of construction management consultants. We're all experienced construction professionals. By and large, the team have all got a QS background. I think I'm probably the exception to that. I'm not a QS. I'm very much a procurement person, and my background is in procurement, mainly for local government and housing associations. So that's how I got into the construction side of things, housing, property repairs, maintenance, investment work, that sort of thing. And then became a consultant in 2018 working with Stradia and largely support public sector with their procurement requirements, but also support the private sector as well. So I very much fall into the procurement area of what we do, but that links quite nicely to our contract advice and dispute resolution side. We also help companies with open book contract management, commercial and cost management, and training. So we do a lot of training in forms of contract, particularly NEC contracts, implementation and management. And then a separate side of the business is we support companies in bidding for work. So largely that is private sector businesses bidding for public sector work. So we help companies with their bid strategy, management and bid writing, and we do have a very good success rate. So contact details at the end if anybody thinks we can support you with any of those things. There's some contact details at the end. So the agenda for this morning, I'm going to focus on the changes with the new legislation. So the old legislation, the public contracts regulations, and then the new legislation is the Procurement Act 2023. And there's a lot of things within there that are very similar to how we used to operate the procurement processes. So I'm going to focus on the things that have changed. I'm going to look at changes for the public sector, what that means for them and how they need to be working, which I think is still interesting for the supplier side to know what has changed and how contracting authorities need to be working now. And then I'm going to look at what those changes mean for suppliers, particularly with getting registered and bidding for work and the initial steps you need to take and then getting ready to bid. So changes for the public sector. The first thing to say is that before you can do anything, whether you're a supplier or whether you're a contracting authority, you need to register. And you may hear people talk about Find a Tender service or the central digital platform, but that's actually the same thing, accessible in the same place, and the link's there on the slide. So the first thing you need to do is to create a one login to get into the government portal, and then you can register either as a buyer or as a supplier. And once that registration is approved by the Cabinet Office, you can then either go in and publish your notices if you're a contracting authority, or you can complete your supplier details if you're a supplier, and I'll talk more about that later. And what I have found in the last few weeks is that if you're like me and you're a consultant that's working with the public sector and needs to publish notices on their behalf, we used to be able to go into the Find a Tender portal and publish notices, but we can no longer do that. So if you are working with the public sector, you need to get that client organisation to register and then invite you in to be able to publish notices on their behalf. But if you're working through the third-party portals, then you can still do that. So it's just a bit of a nuance of the new system, which has come to light in the last few weeks. So first of all, the main changes are we've got a whole raft of new noticing requirements for contracting authorities, which have been headed up as transparency requirements. And this does place quite an admin burden on contracting authorities now because there's a lot more notices that need to be published at various times. And the first thing is the requirement to publish a procurement pipeline notice. So that's from the 1st of April each year. So we're seeing those starting to come through now, and the 56 days pretty much takes you to the end of May. So during April, May each year, contracting authorities are required to publish anything within their procurement pipeline for the next 18 months that's got a contract value of over £2 million. Now that sounds quite high, but that is total contract value. So if you've got something that's potentially 4 or 5 years long, then it's that whole value. And if you've got any options to extend as well, that comes within that value. So I think the aim of this is to try to get the contracting authorities to plan ahead better. I think a lot of the time we don't necessarily get a view of what is going to be coming out. So the intention is to get the contracting authorities to plan better and give the supplier marketplace an earlier view of what might be coming out during the next 18 months. So if there's anything that's of interest to you, you can then track that opportunity. You can also make contact with the contracting authorities and try to engage with them earlier and plan your bidding activity as well against those pipelines. We also now have a requirement to publish market engagement notices. So contracting authorities being actively encouraged to engage early with the market and find out what the market can offer, whether there is appetite to bid for those particular requirements. But where that early engagement is going to be undertaken, the contracting authorities need to put a notice on the Find a Tender portal. So again, it's quite a good opportunity for suppliers to track those market engagement notices and be able to engage early with the contract authorities, make yourselves known to them and try to be involved in that engagement and potentially influence those tenders, the specifications. So we have slight changes to some of the terminology of the notices as well. So we did previously have a contract award notice, and we still have a contract award notice, but it now does a slightly different thing. So previously the contract award notice was at the end of the process, and it was to inform the details of the contract that had been awarded and who had been appointed. But the contract award notice now we issue before the standstill period. And this is a notification of an intent to award the contract. And that notice actually now starts the standstill period. I'll talk a little bit more about contract award processes later and give a little bit more information on that. And then now at the end of the process, once the contract's awarded, we have a contract details notice. So that's confirming that the process is complete, a supplier has been appointed. And then for high value contracts over 5 million, we also need to publish details of the contract. We also have noticing requirements now. If there's a modification to a contract during its term, there's a notice to say that that's happened. And then where a contract's terminated or where it naturally expires, there's also a contract termination notice. So I'll show just a very brief demonstration later of the Find a Tender portal and how to search and how to filter, but it's going to be quite important to filter on the type of notice because we've potentially got all this stuff being advertised and the actual opportunities may become lost in some of this other transparency information that's going to be published. I should have said at the beginning, apologies, if anyone has questions as we go through, if you could pop them into the chat and we'll monitor those questions. Once I've covered the public sector section, we'll have a pause to answer any questions that arise. So if you do have questions, please pop them in the chat and we'll pick them up. So the other part of the transparency requirements is the requirement to report on particular aspects of contracts. And these requirements are not enforced from the commencement of the Act, so we don't have a date for implementation yet. But again, it's going to put quite an admin burden on contracting authorities. And precisely who's going to be interested in all of this information and is going to wade through it is slightly unclear. We do now have a body called the Procurement Review Unit, so whether they will be looking at it, I'm unsure. But these are the aspects that contracting authorities are going to be required to report on. So there's now a requirement within contracts to include a 30-day payment clause. So contracting authorities must pay suppliers within 30 days, and they're going to be required to report on performance against that clause. So twice a year, we'll see a report on payment on all of their contracts where they're complying with a 30 days payment. They're also going to be required to report on individual supplier payments above £30,000. So that's a quarterly report. And then again, for significant contracts, so over £5 million in value, they're going to be required to report on contract performance by publishing annual KPI scores and any details of poor performance. And again, I think the aim of this is to try to drive the contracting authorities to manage their contracts better it's historically been an area where contracting authorities maybe haven't performed quite as well as they could, because this area of procurement hasn't been regulated. The upfront part of appointing suppliers, appointing contractors is regulated, so we need to get that bit right. The contract management isn't regulated, so it's historically been an area where the contracting authorities maybe haven't performed as well as they can. So changes to procurement processes, the threshold values where the Procurement Act comes into force, so areas that are termed covered procurements, haven't changed significantly. These thresholds are for contracting authorities other than central government. Central government have lower thresholds, slightly lower thresholds. The main change is that these figures now include VAT, where previously VAT wasn't included. So effectively, those thresholds have been lowered by 20% by bringing VAT in. And then changes to procurement processes. So many things are very similar to under the old public contracts regulations. So we still have an open tender procedure, which is very similar to the previous open tender. So this is a single stage process where everybody who's interested in the opportunity can submit a tender as long as they meet all of the minimum requirements that's set out. The main change to the processes is that all of the old multi-stage procedures, so the restricted, negotiated, competitive dialogue, have all been amalgamated into this competitive, flexible procedure. And this lets contracting authorities effectively design their own tender process. And initially it was thought that this might be used to run a process similar to the old restricted two-stage process, but I don't think we've seen very much of that coming through as yet. The key thing with this, and the key thing for suppliers to be aware of, is that the contracting authority must set out at the beginning how that competitive, flexible process is going to operate. And it gives them the opportunity to run in multiple stages and to potentially deselect or shortlist suppliers at various stages. So that must be clear at the beginning how that's going to operate. So if there's going to be a selection stage and then a shortlist for tender, and then potentially another shortlist for interview or for negotiation, that needs to be clear within the procurement documents. And as suppliers, you need to know how you're going to be selected or deselected at each stage. And contracting authorities must then follow what they've set out in the tender documents. So there is potentially quite a big area there for challenge and for contracting authorities not getting things right. So that's something to be aware of. And before you decide to participate in a competitive, flexible procedure, make sure you're comfortable with the stages and how much time it's potentially going to take. And we do have an option for direct award in quite limited circumstances. So those circumstances are listed in the Act, and the contracting authorities must be able to fulfil one of those exceptions before they can direct award. We have changed to the standstill period, which used to be 10 calendar days, which is now 8 working days. So a very small change. We used to be able to start on a weekend, but we couldn't end on a weekend. But now it's specific that it is 8 working days. So that's a slight change. Framework agreements for a maximum of 4 years. So that closed framework agreement process is the same as under the previous regulations. But we do now have a new framework, which is an open framework. So this is a benefit to suppliers in that previously, once the framework was awarded for 4 years, it was closed and suppliers couldn't join until that framework came up for renewal again. But now with the open framework, this can be reopened during the term. So if contracting authorities award an open framework, that must be reopened at least once during the first 3 years from award. And then it has to be reopened again within a period of 5 years. So that gives you your 8 years duration. It must be opened a minimum of twice during that time. But there is no limit to how many times the framework can be reopened and new suppliers can be permitted to join. So what we used to see was contracting authorities adding a lot of suppliers to the framework, to make sure there was sufficient capacity, and in case any suppliers dropped off or went out of business or for whatever reason, they wanted to make sure there was enough capacity in that framework. So potentially more suppliers than were required were allowed to join, and that diluted the amount of work available. So hopefully we won't see that so much now because we've got this open framework, and if there's a need, it can be reopened. And then we also have some regulations now that apply to below threshold procurement. So this means that where a contracting authority chooses to advertise something that is below threshold, they need to advertise it through the Find a Tender portal. So that, again, that means everything's available to suppliers in one place through the Find a Tender portal. So hopefully that will be, again, a benefit to suppliers. So this is the main change to the procurement process that I think impacts on the way that suppliers respond to public sector tenders. So the supplier assessment process, which used to be called pre-qualification or selection stage, which we now call conditions of participation or the participation stage. So the first step is for suppliers to register on the central digital platform, which again, I'll cover in a bit more detail later. And you complete all of your basic company information and save it on the central digital platform. The contracting authorities are then not permitted to ask you for that information again. So every time you respond to a tender, you're not completing all of your company information, etc. Once it's completed on the central digital platform, you can share that information when you want to bid for an opportunity, share that information with the contracting authority, and it's then up to the contracting authority to access that information and assess it, rather than you having to send it each time. The contracting authority can then only set conditions of participation that are specific to that project, and the conditions must be relevant and proportionate to that project. And this is things around your legal and financial capacity and your technical ability to perform the contract. So it could be things like levels of insurance, it could be previous experience, it could be particular industry accreditations or qualifications required to do that work. And it is very specific within the legislation now that that must be proportionate to the contract. The next main set of changes is around the contract award process. So previously, when we'd completed the evaluation and we wanted to award a contract, we would send a letter to the participants, to the bidders, informing them of the outcome and giving them some feedback on their tender submission and their scoring. So it was previously called either a standstill letter or an award notification letter, tender feedback letter, all of those things. So that's now called an assessment summary. So when the contracting authority is ready to award the contract, they have to prepare those assessment summaries to go to all of the participants. And at the same time those assessment summaries are sent to the bidders, they need to issue the contract award notice. And that's mandatory to communicate the intent to enter into a contract. And that notice then commences the standstill period of 8 working days. So the assessment summary will contain details of the full assessment criteria, the tenderer's performance and scoring against the assessment criteria, and also the winning tenderer's performance against that criteria, and an explanation of why the tenderer was or wasn't successful. So hopefully there will be some more detailed information in those assessment summaries that will help you in future bids. And then once we've completed the standstill period, assuming that there's no challenges to the procurement, that's when the contract details notice is issued. So that's the confirmation of award and that the contract is going to be entered into. And as I mentioned earlier, for high value contracts, that contract will need to be published, which can be redacted if there's commercially sensitive information in there. So challenges to procurement. There have been some changes to the legislation in this area. The legislation is now much clearer on the remedies that are available in the event of a challenge. Time limits apply to challenges being brought, and that challenge must be a formal civil proceedings brought in the courts. Quite often we see contracting authorities receiving letters asking them to delay entering into a contract or saying that a supplier is going to bring a challenge, but none of those things are actually a formal challenge. If you do wish to challenge a procurement decision, it must be a claim brought in the courts, and that claim is time limited. So it's whichever is the shorter of 30 days from the date that you became aware that you had grounds to challenge, or 6 months from the date the contract was entered into. So if you become aware of something in year 2 of the contract that would have given you grounds to challenge, you're actually out of time at that point. There are specific remedies available. If the challenge is brought during the standstill period, so only if it's brought during the standstill period, then an automatic suspension applies and the contracting authority is not able to enter into a contract until that suspension's lifted or the claim's resolved. So that only applies during standstill. So that's really important if you do think you have grounds to act quickly. Interim measures are orders that the court can make while the claim's ongoing. So it could be to reverse a contracting authority's decision to exclude a supplier and allow them to continue in the procurement process. If the contract hasn't been entered into, then the remedies may be to order the contracting authority to amend the procurement documents, or they can set aside an award decision. If the contract has been entered into, then the remedy will most likely be the award of damages, or in quite extreme circumstances, the contracts can be cancelled so that the award decision can be set aside again. So it is, as I say, it is really important that if you think you have grounds, you must have clear evidence that the contracting authority hasn't complied with their obligations, and it's really important to act in a timely manner and bring that claim quickly if you want to stop the contracting authority from entering into the contract. So that's the end of the public sector section. Do we have any questions at this point?
There's nothing in the chat. Don't know if anyone wants to come in at this point. Sudden silence.
No problem. I'll carry on with the supplier section. If anybody thinks of anything, by all means, carry on popping them into the chat, and there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions. So the key changes from a supplier perspective. So what I did was I took this nice little quote from the Government Commercial Function Short Guide for Suppliers, which says that the Procurement Act will improve and streamline the way procurement is done and will benefit prospective suppliers of all sizes. So I don't know as suppliers if we're feeling that at the moment or seeing that. It does seem like there is a bit of work to do at the beginning to get set up under the Act and get ready to be able to respond to public sector opportunities. So hopefully what I'm going to tell you in the next section will help with that and also signpost to further information. So how do we find opportunities for suppliers? So everything is published through the Find a Tender Service portal, which I've popped the link there. You don't need to register to be able to search for opportunities. So to be able to go onto the Find a Tender portal and have a look, get a feel for how that works, whether there's things on there that would be of interest and you wish to bid for, you don't need to register to do that. All opportunities that are above and below threshold must be advertised on this Find a Tender portal. So the key message really is that there is no need to use the subscription services anymore. And previously we saw a lot of suppliers using subscription services that would pull together all of the information on contracts that were advertised. But everything is through Find a Tender. You can go on there, and then if you do want to register, you can then create an alert. So you can set the frequency of that alert to notify you either daily, weekly, monthly of potential opportunities that you might want to bid for. You can search by keyword, by CPV code, by location, and by the type of notice. So you can kind of filter down that search to help you. And what I'm going to do is I popped a link at the bottom of the slide, but I have this open on another screen, so hopefully this will work. I'm just going to pop this across. So this is what the Find a Tender Service portal looks like. And in here, I've just put a keyword search of window, and I've just filtered on open opportunities and tender notice. And you can see here it's brought up 73 notices that have got the word window in them. So when we scroll down, you can see all the individual opportunities. And then we can filter further by location. So if you want to say, well, actually, I'm only interested in opportunities in the northwest of England, we just pop that on, add that to your filter, and then update the results again. And that will, as you can see here now, that's brought up 11 notices that are potentially of interest if you're a window contractor in the northwest. And you can have a look at those notices. If you click on the title, it will give you more information about what's involved in that project. And then I previously mentioned the procurement pipeline that contracting authorities are required to issue around this time of year. The important thing with this is the pipeline isn't an open opportunity. So we take the open opportunity off and pop the pipeline filter on. And I'll just take off the northwest just to make sure we get something. And then if I update those results again, so now we've got everything that's a pipeline notice. So by clicking into each of these, you will be able to see when they are potentially coming out to the market. So again, we've got at the top here, we've got 4 potential notices this year for window installations. So it's quite easy to be able to set up and then to save a search. So let me just pop that out of the way. So again, when we share the slides, the links are all in the slides to help you navigate. So how registering on the central digital platform. So I think this is a benefit to suppliers in being able to populate your basic company information in one place and not having to complete that every time you respond to an opportunity. So once you're registered and your registration has been approved on the central digital platform, you can go in and complete that company information. And it is quite basic information. So it's your organisation details, your name, address, your incorporation information if you're a registered company, details of your connected person, so anybody who has significant control of the business. There's optional fields to put in any trade or professional qualifications. You can add that information in there. And there's now just one declaration. So where previously we had a whole list of mandatory and discretionary exclusions, and you had to go through and tick each one every time, there is just one declaration to say either none of them apply and you haven't been found guilty of any offences, or if there is anything that you need to declare, there's the ability to upload that information. And you can also upload your latest 2 years of accounts and save those on the portal. So once all that's done and you submit it, and it'll create a share code that you can then issue to contracting authorities when you want to bid, or you can download that information as a PDF document and you can send that with your tender submission as well. So there is definitely a benefit, but the information is quite basic that's saved on there, and the contracting authorities will still set some conditions of participation that you'll have to respond to for each particular project. The link at the bottom of this slide is the link to the government information for suppliers site, and there is quite a lot of additional support available. There's some YouTube videos to watch for various aspects of the process, and you can also access various guides and what have you about bidding and registering and all of that stuff, just information about the Act. So that is quite a useful resource. So the last bit is how can you get bid ready other than registering on the portal and completing your information, how do you then respond? And it is also worth saying that the contracting authorities will still use their own third-party portals to actually issue the procurement documents and for you to upload responses. So while the legislation is trying to make things more consistent and more centrally available, you will still need to register on the individual portals to be able to bid for opportunities. But that once you've found that notice and found something that's potentially of interest for you to respond to, that notice should give you the link to the portal that's being used. So if you're not already registered, you can get registered on that portal, which is usually quite a simple process, and they are free to register as well. So other than the information, the basic company information on the portal, the things that it's worth collating and getting together so you have them to hand to respond to any bids are details of your insurances and making sure you've got your insurance certificates available to send. Generally, contracting authorities will ask for employers and public liability insurance, and then depending on the nature of the contract, they might also ask for product liability and professional indemnity insurance. So it's worth just considering whether for your type of work, whether it's worth having those things in place. Health and safety. So again, depending on the nature of the contract, if you are working in a construction related sector, the safety schemes in procurement is really worth having a look at. So procurement professionals are encouraged to look at the safety schemes in procurement portal, and all of the individual health and safety schemes that are accredited or recognised by SIP are all collated in one place. So the contracting authority shouldn't be saying you need to have membership of one particular health and safety scheme, so such as CHAS. They should be recognising all of those schemes that are recognised by SIP. So if you have one of those schemes, it's worth just knowing that that does fall under the SIP scheme and that you are accredited and having that information to hand. If you're not working in a construction related industry, then just making sure you've got your health and safety policy and you've got any risk assessments in place and you can respond to any health and safety questions. Again, thinking about the relevant and proportionate, if you're not working in a construction related industry, then the contracting authorities shouldn't be asking you to have membership of one of the SIP schemes because that wouldn't be proportionate. And quality management, and whether you have any of the ISO accreditations for any of these things, it's worth having that information to hand. If you don't have an ISO accreditation, just thinking about what you do around quality management and assuring the quality of your work, and whether you have any quality policies or quality manuals, making sure you've got all of that information to hand to be able to respond to the bids. Social value is something that we're seeing increasingly coming to the fore, which it has been rising in importance over the last probably 5 years now. But again, under the new legislation, contracting authorities are being encouraged to give even higher importance to social value and driving additional benefits through procurement. For consultancy businesses, this is really, it is quite difficult. So it's worth thinking about any community benefits that you can offer. So anything that's environmental, social or economic benefits, particularly if there's any kind of environmental improvements to local communities you can offer as a value add to that consultancy, to whatever that might be. Whether you can offer any kind of careers sessions and going to schools and talking to them about careers in your consultancy related area, so anything like that. But it is very difficult, and we do see, particularly for us as a consultancy business responding to bids, sometimes those social value criteria are not particularly well thought through for consultancy businesses. But again, we're going back to the relevant and proportionate, and contracting authorities should be giving some thought to that and what they're actually looking for in terms of those community benefits. Think about any industry specific accreditations that you might have in place. So whether that's gas safe, whether there's electrical accreditations, any fire safety or fire related works. Again, we're increasingly seeing that come to the fore, with the outcome of the Grenfell inquiry still being published and still coming out into the public domain. The requirements around fire safety and building safety are ever increasing. So if you do have experience and accreditations in that area, make sure you've got those up to date and you have them to hand to be able to bid. Any individual qualifications, so if you have any professional accreditations and evidence of your continuing professional development, that's always important to have to hand, because the contracting authorities may ask for that as part of the technical ability questions. Again, anything on information security, we're seeing that increasingly come to the fore, and it's been quite high profile in the media currently with the attacks on the banks and Marks and Spencers. And I think there was a new one this morning that I heard, and I can't remember who it was, but somebody else who's had a cyber attack. So anything around that, again, is becoming increasingly important. So if you do have Cyber Essentials or any of the other information security accreditation like the ISO 27000, then have those to hand. Also, anything around data protection and data protection policies, if you are receiving any personal data from the contracting authorities, if there's any kind of data transfer, make sure you have your policies and procedures around that, and that you have a nominated person who's the data protection contact. That's really important. And then examples of your previous experience. So if you can think about any previous contracts that you've had that you're particularly proud of, anything of note, and just create a short case study around that. So what did you do? What were the particular challenges, and what were the outcomes that you're particularly proud of, and anything of note that you did differently, anything a bit out of the ordinary, anything a bit challenging. Just a really brief, maybe 200-300 word case study that you can use to demonstrate your previous experience. Quite often contracting authorities will ask for this, and we just get a list of the contact information, very brief details about the contract, so it doesn't tell an awful lot. So if you can use that to really demonstrate how you've dealt with a particular challenge or dealt with anything in a different way, that's really helpful. So hopefully people have found that useful. We've got time for questions, if there are any questions. And while we're waiting for that, I'll just pop my contact details up. I think Suzanne will share these slides, won't we? So if there's any questions about today that you think of later, or anything else that you think we might be able to help with, please feel free to drop me an email and we'll pick that up and we can provide some support. So Suzanne, any questions?
Yes, I've been having a look in the chat here. There was a bit of discussion went on, just saying that Scotland's got its own Procurement Act and that Northern Ireland uses this one, but with a few minor adaptations. So people perhaps need to be aware of that. One gentleman replied that it's the co-op who have had the cyber attack this morning, which I'd seen as well. Yeah. And we have a question which says, do single stage restricted tenders have to be published on Find a Tender? And then in brackets, under threshold.
So if it's below threshold, this is a slight nuance of the regulations. So what it says is that if the contracting authority chooses to advertise, so if their internal rules, for example, said that anything over £50,000 needed to be advertised, then they would have to advertise that on Find a Tender. But anything that's below the Procurement Act threshold, it's up to the contracting authority whether they choose to advertise that. So they may still, for below threshold contracts, choose to invite quotes from 3, 4, 5 companies without actually advertising. So again, it's quite important to try and engage with contracting authorities in your area, anybody that you're aware of that you would like to work with. Use the tools to search to see what they've got coming up, but also to try to make contact with the procurement teams and make them aware of you, because potentially we could see a reduction in the advertising of below threshold contracts. Now there is these additional requirements for below threshold procurement. So If they choose to advertise and they are caught by the legislation, they need to publish the contract notice. They still need to have the open and transparent criteria, and they need to publish the award notice. So it may be that contracting authorities choose to amend their internal financial procedures so they don't need to advertise things that are below threshold. But I guess that remains to be seen how that goes. But if they choose to advertise, then yes, they do need to advertise it on the finder tender.
Thank you, Jenny. There's another question popped up. Are organised crime checks of lowest tenderers a legal requirement now, or simply an organisational only policy decision?
So that would fall within the mandatory and discretionary exclusions. So there's various questions in there, and it says, have you been found guilty of all of these things, any or all of these things? And suppliers need to declare if they have been found guilty. As you would imagine, if people have been found guilty of organised crime, I can't imagine they're going to declare that. So it's what other due diligence checks do the contracting authorities do before they award a contract, and they should be doing those kind of checks anyway. I hope that helps a little bit.
Thank you. And another one has just come in. What is defined as a contract change such that a notice needs to be issued?
So it's for services, it's a change of plus or minus 10% of the value or of the contract duration. And for works, it's plus or minus 15%. So if there's a change that added 20% extra value to the work, then that would be a notifiable change.
Okay. And Colin is saying the Act has introduced a duty to consider lots. In practice, how should contracting authorities implement this requirement, or can they still avoid doing so to continuing economic operators, as the latter will not help SMEs?
Yes, it's difficult, isn't it? There is a duty to consider dividing your contract into smaller lots, but then there's also an obligation to ensure you're obtaining the best value for money. So those two things do conflict. I think it's really taking a sensible and pragmatic decision on a project by project basis. So what do you want to achieve from the project? Do you want to appoint local companies, and can you sensibly break the contract down into lots? And for things like maybe a responsive repairs contract where you've got different types of work, you could break it down into kind of electrical work, heating work, whatever that might look like. But for particular service contracts, it might not be sensible to break it down into lots. So, for example, if you have a grounds maintenance contract, it would make sense to have one contractor coming and cutting all of your grass and all of your hedges and all of that stuff, and you get a consistent service across all of your estate. So I think it is quite difficult, and there isn't really any specific criteria within the legislation that says this must be broken down into lots and this shouldn't. There is somewhere in the contract notice now to put some information onto whether you've considered lots wouldn't be applicable and the reasons for that. So you can pop some information in there to say why. And I think it's trying to balance those kind of conflicting drivers and what you want to achieve from that particular contract.
Thank you, Jenny. That's all we've got in the chat. Does anyone else have anything before we close out? I think we're probably done.
Thank you very much for your questions.
Oh, John, John, you've got your hand up. Do you want to put your microphone on and just come in? John Leach? John, you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sorry, I was just I couldn't find my mic button, which isn't usual. Sorry, did we say we can have a copy of the slides please. Would that be okay after the
Oh, right.
meeting?
Yes, I was just about to say that as I was
That's right.
closing,
Okay.
that if anyone wants the slides, either email me or pop something in the chat now and I'll pick that up and we can send those out for you. I know Jenny covered an awful lot of information this morning and it was probably too much for us all to take in. So yes, I'm happy to do that. Also CPD certificates, if you want one of those, again, email me or just pop something quickly in the chat before we close out. So if we're all done, Steve, you've got your hand up. Have you got a question or?
Yeah, does anybody actually think UK government is going to move towards kind of enable SMEs to participate in government procurement, because they're putting more and more barriers up as the years go on. It's much more restrictive here than it is in Europe. You know, small businesses can survive quite happily working hand in hand with government there. It's pretty much not the case here.
I agree entirely. I think when I popped that little quote up earlier from the supplier guide, and all of the headlines that we saw before the Act was implemented was it's going to make procurement easier for easier for contracting authorities, easier for suppliers. And when you actually look at the legislation, I think there's more regulations than there was under the previous public contracts regulations. So working on both sides as a small business and as a small business helping the public sector, at the moment, I'm not feeling that it's easier by any means. And I think the requirements to register and all of that, there are some benefits, but when you look at the information that's held on the central digital platform, there's not a great deal of information there. So there will be a requirement to complete quite a lot of questions, I think, as part of a bid submission. And that, I think, what we have now will be what we have for the foreseeable future. I can't see that being amended, rewritten. The legislation's taken 5 years to come into force, I think. Yeah, so I think
the problem is all these criteria, and I've used to work for MOPS doing procurement, government procurement. So we used to do a lot of assessment for MOD and prisons and all the other guys. All of these action activities that we're providing information to them, to their portal, all end up getting point scored to take out impartiality, and therefore it always ends up favouring the big guys and never favours the SMEs. So you really, unless you've got somebody within the organisation fighting your corner, you've got very little chance of winning anything. And it seems that this is taking more of that ability of the procuring authority to be able to have that flexibility of trying to get the right person to deliver the job.
And that's where I'm hoping that if the contracting authorities are pragmatic, anything that's below threshold, they don't have to advertise. They're not obliged to advertise. So hopefully they will be pragmatic in writing their own internal procurement rules, financial regulations, whatever they are called, that will allow them to engage with the local small companies. But that remains to be seen. And how many of them out there are pragmatic, I don't know. We'll see over time, won't we?
It's more the case to ask someone, because excuse my language. Yeah, they're not willing to make a decision generally that could be overturned. So that normally speaking, they won't take that pragmatic approach. It just, well, that's what the form tells us, so that's what we're doing. Which has always been my trouble as a loan, not all the things I seem to play, but I work in a field where the types of stuff I'm dealing with are mega projects, and they're to try and get onto the government side of it is impossible. I will do it from the client side now because there's no, or the contracting side, because I can go in under their umbrella but it's getting increasingly difficult now in the UK, especially with IR35 and all the other laws that have come in, being able to function in the UK market on that basis is very big.
Yeah,
But
I agree. I agree.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you. Okay, so thank you, Jenny. That was a really interesting presentation. I know you've covered an awful lot there, so thank you very much. Thank you all for attending. Hope to see you again soon. Our next one, it says, just checking the notes, it'll be the 5th of June. That's the first Thursday in June, where we will have a virtual simulation of a cyber crisis. So it will show a ransomware incident, and we will look at the consequences of that for your business should it happen to you. And we've already talked about it this morning, and I know these are big organizations we're talking about now, but it can happen to anyone. So that's actually being given, the presentations by an insurance company, but it will be a simulation of the events and the consequences that they can have and what we need to be looking out for. So that should be really interesting. I'm looking forward to that. So again, thank you, Jenny, very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
And look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Good day.
Thanks, guys. Well done, Jenny.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, excellent. Well done.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you.